Hey everyone, Dockwell here, and welcome to another one of my Dota 2 hero guides. Today we're going to be taking a look at Grimstroke. Grimstroke is a support who usually plays 5, but can also play 4, and he has had patches where people like Thompson will play in mid, but it's never really caught on as a viable position for the hero. I think you can make it work, but we're not really going to focus on that because it is so obscure and it's never really been played in the highest level like that. So we're mostly going to be focusing on how to play this hero as a support. And as a support, how do we think about Grimstroke? Well, Grimstroke's kind of an odd hero. We'll see that in a bit when I go through all of his abilities, but he has a stun, but it's kind of like an AoE stun that you place on an ally yourself, so positioning matters. You have a silence, but it's not a silence like, Skywrath silence. It's like this weird bug that you put on somebody, and then you also have a way to farm, kind of, and you're good against illusion heroes, but it's a bit of a skill shot. So it's not always clear to like a new player, someone that's unfamiliar with the hero, how to incorporate all of his skills together to make the hero good. But once you really understand how to play Grimstroke to his full potential, he can be a very, very powerful support. The one ability, however, that is pretty straightforward is his ultimate, and we'll see that again in a second, but his ultimate is one of the most powerful ultimates in the game because you pretty much double any single target spell. And so that makes insane combinations with like Doom or Necro. Those are the two big ones that you would think of. But really any single target spell is just amplified even more by Grimstroke. So that's kind of the main way you can think about this hero is there's a little bit of quirkiness, but really any single target spells on your team are just amplified even more when you have a Grimstroke and you cast that spell in a team fight. It just kind of amps up everything that's going on, whether you do have a Doom or whether you just have something like, a Wraith King stun or whatever it is. It just kind of multiplies the effectiveness of the other heroes on your team. But before we can really understand how to play Grimstroke in a game, we have to take a look at his abilities. So now that we understand Grimstroke in general, let's take a look at his abilities. So first we can look at Stroke of Fate. It's a pretty straightforward spell. You can see it has a huge AoE. You're going to use this spell early on to harass, to do damage, and to also clear creep waves and get farm, but it also scales because it's pretty good against illusions. You can also do significant damage if there's a bunch of people grouped up because of the way it works, because of the way it amplifies damage. So let me just show you it. It does a little spin move, and then some ink flies out in a direction. You can also aim it at heroes. Let's put free spells on here. And you can see it also does a little bit more damage to this axe back here when it hit this first axe. So that's why it's good against illusions, because if there's like a PL especially, and he has a ton of illusions in one spot, you use the Stroke of Fate and it does a ton of illusion damage, and it can clear through illusions pretty well, or really you can see which is the real PL, which is the real Naga, all that kind of stuff. So it can be very effective in that way. But otherwise, it's a pretty straightforward spell. The only thing else I would say that is a little more skill shot oriented is the fact that it does have a cast animation, so you do have to kind of like aim it, and you can see I'm canceling it there with the stop command. So like you do a little spin. It's sort of like how Anti-Mage spins when he blinks as well, so that you can't really tell where Anti-Mage is blinking to. It's the same kind of thing where you can't really tell where the Grimstroke is aiming. I mean, you can kind of tell if you're good with the hero, you know how the hero has an animation, but still, it's not like exactly straightforward where he's going to be using Stroke of Fate. Now, it has a very long range, as I said before, so you can hit targets from pretty far away, but you're going to have to aim it ahead of them a lot if they're walking in a straight line. So anyway, like I said, pretty straightforward ability, but it is a little bit of a skill shot, kind of scales in the late game in some ways. So that's Stroke of Fate. Next, we have Phantom's Embrace. This is a pretty easy spell to cast. There's not really a skill shot or anything like that. You just click it on an enemy, and this little bug comes out, this little ghost or whatever. What does it say? Is it a phantom? Yeah, obviously it's Phantom's Embrace. What am I, an idiot? Anyway, you cast this phantom out, and it silences the enemies. You can see the axe is silenced there, and it does a little bit of damage over time. But then the thing is, if it actually lasts the full duration, it does even more damage. And then it also refreshes your cooldown. So actually, let me take free spells off there and show you again. So right now it's on cooldown. But then once that silence is done and it comes back to me, I can cast it again. So it's very important to cast this on a disarmed enemy or someone that has Ghost Scepter or something like that where they can't attack, or they're stunned, because then they can't attack when they're stunned, so that you get the full duration. Now obviously that's not going to happen all the time because people are going to be able to right click it. So it is like an ability that you can right click. So you can see it has a little health bar there. So the axe is able to right click that. So if you cast it on them, they're going to right click that thing and they're going to get it off them because they know it's going to do damage if they let it stay on them more, and then you're going to be able to cast it again, which is even worse for them after it comes off and then does that damage. So it's one of those abilities that it's not really a skill shot, but you do have to use it at the correct time because it's not just a simple silence like I said before, like a Skywrath silence. It's not just that straightforward. But that's Phantom's Embrace. Then lastly, for normal abilities, we have Inkswell, and this is a stun, but like I said, it's not just a typical stun. You have to cast it on yourself or an ally, so let's just cast it on myself right here, and you can see these little tendrils come out doing damage, and then after, a certain amount of time, it just kind of explodes and stuns, and it's all based on the damage it does and all that kind of stuff, based on how, long those tendrils were kind of damaging and touching the enemies. You can see I touched that axe there with these tendrils for a while, so you can see they're both stunned for that same amount of time, but this guy took more damage, and that's kind of the big thing. Now, the stun is all based on how long you have it casting, because you can press it again and stun early, but the stun duration is shorter. So that's why you can kind of just click this, and then boom, you can, if they're running away, the enemy's running away, or you think that you don't have as much movement speed or whatever it is, they're going to blink or something like that, or you need to cancel a TP instantly. That's really effective for doing those things now, because you can just pop it instantly, which is very good, because in the past you actually would just have to wait the full duration. And I think that was a huge change. I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, maybe it was even shorter time than that really made this hero come into the meta, because before you had to wait the full duration. It just was not a reliable spell, and now it really is, and he's very good in the laning stage because of that, can cancel TPs and do all those kinds of things. So that's Inkswell. And then lastly, we have Soulbind, which this is actually a very easy ability to cast, because you literally just press it on an enemy, and then the closest enemy is linked to that, their ally. And so you can see they're trying to run in different directions, and they can't do it, which is really good for kind of controlling team fights. If there's two heroes trying to run away from each other in opposite directions, they can't really do that. It's kind of hard to navigate. Like, you just are on this weird leash, and it's just hard to coordinate with your team, especially in pubs, where it's like one guy's running this way, you want to run the other way for whatever reason. And it just seems to always happen when you cast this on people in pubs. But obviously, like I said before, when you cast it, it just amps up everything you do, because you can see there, when I cast Phantom's Embrace, it's a single target spell, it goes to both of them. And so you can use Doom, you can use Necro's ult, all that kind of stuff to just amp up everything that your allies are doing, or obviously like you're doing with the silence. It is interesting that, he only has one single target ability, so it's mostly about amping up your team, but still can be very effective and really straightforward and simple to cast and use in team fights. So that's Grimstroke. Those are his abilities. I will briefly mention the other, Ags and Ags Shard, just because you may not be getting it a lot in games, because, if this hero is playing 5, you're not getting a ton of farm, but I think Ags is something to mention, because it does have games, situations, matchups where it's extremely useful. And what you do with this ability is you just make a copy, like a very strong illusion of an enemy. So let's say you're playing against like an anti-mage or something like that. It is extremely good to make a copy of anti-mage, because you get that mana burn, you get all the benefits of that. There's just some really great matchups where you can use this ability with Dark Portrait. Obviously, you're not going to get it till later in the game, but still, if you do get it, you can just honestly win games straight up with it. So you are a support that has a very strong Ags that can just dominate games. And then the main thing about the Shard is basically that it just adds a Dispel. You can read the other things that it does, but the strong Dispel at the end when you kind of actually activate the stun is extremely important. I can actually just show you that here with the axe. I'll cast this on him, and then I'll place this on me, and then I'll do this again, boom, and then you can see the Battle Hunger, which is dispellable, is removed from Grimstroke after you actually activate the stun on your Inkswell. So it just makes it that much more dynamic. It's already a pretty good spell. It's probably the best spell the hero has now. A good stun, good to like place on an ally or whatever, or get yourself out of a sticky situation. But really, like, the biggest one I always think of is like a Bristleback, or someone that just wants to jump in, run in, very tanky, annoying to deal with, kind of run people down. But now you also have the Dispel, so you can save people with it. You can also just make sure that they're able to run in even more effectively, because you can dispel all those slows off of them if they're trying to get counter-ganked, or if they're trying to stop them from doing what they want to do. So the Shard is extremely important. You're probably going to get it pretty early on. Makes that ability even more dynamic. So Grimstroke's laning stage isn't the most complicated, but it's also not super straightforward. Basically, you're going to be skilling all three of your abilities at some point. It's just a question of when and which one do you max. Now, really, you're only going to be maxing probably one of two, which is Stroke of Fate or Inkswell, so the stun or the damage ability, and it's kind of just all matchup dependent. Are you going to get aggressive with the stun a lot, so you can place it on your carry, or maybe you're a force, so you're placing it on the offlaner, and they're just going to chase people down, get the stun off, and just like kill a lot in the lane? Or are you just going to harass from a distance? I mean, that's honestly the main thing. Or if you're playing against an illusion hero, that's also another thing where you might just want to, max your damage ability. The other consideration is the lower MMR you go, the more I'd probably go for farming, which is the damage ability, Stroke of Fate, and less for like the aggressive stun ability, just because you're not always going to be able to rely on your allies to like do the right thing and chase people down and all that kind of stuff. And then the third consideration really for the third ability for your silence is when do you put a point in Phantom's Embrace. And that's, again, all matchup dependent because, you know, sometimes silencing the enemy is not a big deal because really they just run you down and right click you. But then sometimes the enemy is all about the spell casting. So they're really not the best right clicker. They're all about casting their spells. And so Phantom's Embrace is a big deal, or they don't have a good attack animation. So getting Phantom's Embrace off of them is difficult. So there's a lot of different considerations there. But once you actually know what you're doing, which, you know, it can take some games to figure out, it's really not that complicated to actually play the hero when you know what you're doing against matchups, but it is very matchup dependent. Then transitioning out of the laning stage, just like a lot of other supports, you're going to want to use your ultimate off cooldown if you can, because it's a pretty powerful ultimate. Now, again, it's kind of matchup dependent. It's like, is your ultimate good with something like Doom or something like Necro? It's like there's a super powerful spell that you're like timing it with, because if there is, you kind of want to time using your ultimate with that other ability and go, you know, around the map with that hero and play around that hero. Now, that doesn't always happen in every game because it's a pub, you know, it's hard to really coordinate all the time and the picks aren't always going to be perfect. So if you don't really have any great pairing with your ultimate, then what you want to do usually is like defend a lane, farm a lane, push it out, and then just like TP to a fight or be at a fight to use your ultimate just to like add a little bit extra to the fight, and not just like focus on running around with one hero. Those are kind of the two different things you're going to be doing in the transition into the later portion of the game. And then kind of the lower MMR you go, the more I would focus on that farming, defending towers, you know, maxing out Stroke of Fate and just getting farm when you can so that you can get into your later game items. And then transitioning to the later portion of the game, in the late game team fights, the most important thing to consider is who you're casting your ultimate on and when you're doing that, because you don't really want to waste it on somebody that it doesn't do anything to. You know, they're just going to stand their ground, so they don't really care about running away. Or you don't want to waste it, you know, at a time where it doesn't really do anything, where it's not really effective because you're not chasing people down, or maybe you're casting it on two enemies, but they're just running you down anyway, or it doesn't really affect them that they have to run away from each other, or they can't run away from each other, that kind of stuff. So you make sure that you're casting on the right hero, which often is going to be a mobility-based hero. So a mid hero usually, but there's other carries that are mobility-based because for the most part, you know, the length or the distance between the soulbind targets is usually long enough that in chaotic team fights, you're going to have two targets linked up almost all the time. Now, if you don't, that's also another thing where it's like you need to consider that. Like, make sure you're casting it on somebody where there's another hero close to them so they actually get linked up so it's actually effective. But for the most part, you're going to want to put it on a mobility person so that they can't, you know, use their mobility, or they're stuck to someone else and they don't really want to get away. Or sometimes it can be good to stick it on, you know, a core and a support, where the support's trying to be in the back, but the bristleback or whatever, you know, is trying to be in the front, or the centaur, and doesn't really, you know, what they're trying to do is exactly the opposite in the fight, and that can be good as well. The other thing to consider then is if you do have a big combo on, you know, any of the ultimates in your team, then you really want to consider, okay, who am I dooming? Because you just have to think, like, if there's a Doom on your team and you're going to be using Doom, who is the best target to doom? It's like, well, we want to doom that guy, so I'm going to cast Soulbind on him, and then hopefully it just links to someone else on his team, and then you just get the double doom off on the other guy for free. And that's kind of how you want to be thinking about Soulbind in general. And that's the main consideration late in team fights. Now, obviously, you have your other abilities, your stun and your dispel and all that kind of stuff if you get your shard and things like that. But the main thing is your ultimate. You really are an ultimate-based hero unless you get your Ags, and then it's like, okay, well, now you have an Ags. It kind of changes the dynamic. Who are you know, using your Ags on the enemy, and then how are you using that? You're kind of almost like a Darkseer in this way because you're using an illusion kind of as your main hero. It's like, it gets a little bit more complicated in that way, but those are only for late-game scenarios. You're not going to get to that item all that much, but it is definitely a consideration once you get there of, like, who are you copying and how are you microing that illusion, because that can honestly be a huge change in late-game team fights. And that, everyone, is my Grimstroke guide. If you liked the video or found it helpful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.